dangerous juvenile suspects not being booked into the juvenile detention facility in Pierce County. It's become quite a problem. But maybe Bob Ferguson should look into that and care about public safety. I'm Bob Ferguson. Oh, no, I don't care about any of that. Totally irrelevant. I'm going to just pretend to be the public safety candidate long enough to get into the governor's office. And then after that, I'll go back to my old ways of not caring at all. This segment is brought to you by Eastside Weight Loss Clinic. I'm down 37 pounds on the program, and I lost most of that weight in just 2 months. There's no prepackaged meals, no counting calories, no drugs or injections. Schedule your free 15-minute consultation today at eastsideweightlossclinic.com. On the show yesterday, we talked about this letter that was sent out, and it's really kind of an open letter, I think, to the community to let them know what's going on. It was from the Pierce County police chiefs. So all the police chiefs who represent cities in Pierce County sent this out, expressing their frustration with the fact that they have some juvenile offenders who they arrest for pretty serious, sometimes violent crimes, and the jail won't book them. The juvenile detention center called Reman Hall there won't book them in, and they say they have a policy against booking juveniles for misdemeanor crimes, even if that misdemeanor crime is a domestic violence assault. So Fife Police Chief Pete Fisher says that one of the things that led up to this letter is a case that they had, where they had a juvenile offender who committed a allegedly domestic violence assault against their father. And we know how serious, when I used to cover crime and justice, domestic violence calls were some of the most dangerous calls police could respond to. And often domestic violence can lead to things like murder. And so it's important to separate the parties. But when it's a misdemeanor, these cops, they're just like, what do we do? Because they're not going to be booked into jail. So it's been this whole ordeal, and it's part of this crumbling justice system for juvenile offenders. We've talked about it so much. I mean, you've got young kids committing adult-sized crimes, and then there isn't the punishment and the accountability on the back end. So Fife Police Chief Pete Fisher was nice enough to join us today to talk about it. Chief Fisher, welcome to Undivided.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you're amongst those who are speaking out about this issue, because we've really seen it take a turn, and I'm worried. I don't know how we're gonna improve the situation. So just generally speaking, in your city, what kind of crimes are you seeing juveniles involved in?
I think we're fairly fortunate. Obviously, we do have juvenile crime, but that tends to be on the lower side for us. Unfortunately, this is just our turn in the bucket, so to speak, where jurisdictions throughout Pierce County have faced this for months and probably over a year. We've been trying to address this with Raymond Hall with no results.
Yeah, so Raymond Hall is what?
Raymond Hall is the juvenile detention center here in Pierce County.
Yeah, and so describe the issue that you're having, because this relates to, I mean, there's issues across Pierce County. We've had several law enforcement, of your law enforcement partners on to talk about the juvenile crime crisis, but your frustration has to do specifically with a case involving a 17-year-old.
It does. Our most recent case, we've had 2 of these. Our most recent case was a 17-year-old that assaulted dad, punched holes in the wall, took the phone away, keeping him from calling 911. Wow. All misdemeanor level crimes, but I would say violent. They're physical crimes of physical violence against another. And so our sergeant called Raymond Hall, asked to book them. They said, no, they're only booking for felonies. It brought to my attention because they had concerns that if they left the juvenile on scene, that there'd be further assaults or escalation of violence, which I think is probably a smart assessment on their part. And so I called Raymond Hall directly, had a conversation with them, and they said, no, we're not booking for misdemeanors. And so we were concerned enough at that point to reach out to the prosecuting attorney's office to see if they could plead our case for us. And as you can see from the email, they got the same response from Raymond Hall that we did, that they don't book juveniles for misdemeanors. And what's even more frustrating is their response last night when this was brought to their attention. They said, well, Fife didn't provide police reports or provide us for enough information to do our override procedures. Well, the sergeant called, I called, the prosecuting attorney's office called. We provide the reports to the prosecutor as soon as they ask for them. I'm at a total loss to know what we could have done more for them to change their mind, saying they don't book under those circumstances. In this case, we had to release the juvenile to their mom. The mom got a hotel room for the juvenile so he wouldn't be at home with the dad. That is not a position we want family members to be in. And I definitely do not want our police officers being put in that impossible decision of having to make that decision themselves because of a poor policy decision.
Well, my understanding is with domestic violence cases, isn't it the law that someone has to be booked? Is that just for adults? And why would the adult, why, if that's the case, and please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing, why would it be different for a juvenile who committed the same kind of crime?
So that's an actual interesting question. When you look at the mandatory arrest law, it states that the suspect has to be 18 or older for it to be a mandatory arrest. So there's still discretion when we're talking about juvenile offenders in regards to domestic violence crimes. I don't think that's a great policy decision, right? We have a mandatory arrest in the state to ensure that there's separation between the victim and offender, and there's a cooling off period. And those are for adults. So if our juveniles whose minds are not fully developed are prone to make emotional decisions, wouldn't it make sense that they have that same cooling off period?
100%. I'm not trying to link the two because I don't know. I mean, you described what the 17-year-old did, but we just had a case with a 15-year-old who killed his whole family. So, I mean, juveniles, I'm not saying that this 17-year-old's capable of that, but as you said, with juveniles, I mean, they can commit very serious adult crimes, and a cooling off period just makes sense. So who makes the ultimate decision at Riemann Hall about what their policy will be? Whose policy is that, and who decides it?
I don't have a good answer for that. I do know, and I think this is positive, that based on our position and the media attention we're getting, I do have a meeting tomorrow morning now with the presiding judge. And so that's a question I'm going to ask. It seems, I'm going to use the flyer I see in the back of the computer, a common sense policy decision that juveniles that commit crimes of violence, that make threats of physical violence, should be detained in the juvenile detention facility. Officers should not be forced to make decisions on what to do with juveniles when they're refused to be booked for those types of crimes.
Right. And I mean, not every family could afford to put their kid up in a hotel to keep them away from their dad or whatever family member it is. So the likelihood they might just head back. But just generally, I mean, it's not just the DV cases that we've seen. We've seen a lot of judges who are really hesitant during first appearances, even when someone is booked, to hold a juvenile, to give a juvenile any amount of bail on a promise to appear or anything like that. Have you guys witnessed that as well in the court system, that juveniles are just really being treated completely differently?
It's funny you should say that. I talked about this being our second case. Our first case where they refused to book a juvenile DV suspect was in January. We had an officer arrest a 16-year-old female for punching mom in the face, scratching her. And she happened to be on electronic home monitoring for a robbery charge, and they wouldn't take her. And so that's our experience with Raymond Hall. And we've tried a number of times, myself, as part of the Pierce County Police Chiefs Association, to have conversations with our prosecutor, Raymond Hall, to fix what I think is a broken system. If you are making officers make decisions like this in the field, it's broken. They exist to make sure that these types of people are in custody so there are not further assaults or further violence or escalating violence.
Just so I heard that correctly, the juvenile young female, she had electronic home monitoring for an ongoing robbery case.
Correct.
And they wouldn't make an exception for her when she committed a DV.
That's correct.
Doesn't that open the city up to liability? I don't know if you can answer that, but if you don't arrest someone, they just committed a DV and they get sent back home and hurt someone, isn't the city liable for that in some form or fashion?
Again, I think that's our concern, is they're going to argue that you had a responsibility, that you were dealing with them, they committed a crime, you should have taken them in custody. And that liability not only falls to the city, but we're trying to protect the officers from that. That's really why I'm speaking out. The officers are the ones getting forced to make this decision. And I think I need to point out that we're very fortunate here in Fife that this happened at a time where I was at the office. There was people at Raymond Hall. The prosecutor's office was staffed. Typically, officers getting forced to make this decision at 2 or 3 in the morning when there's no one to call. And that, again, is not acceptable.
Yeah, well, not that it changed the outcome. I mean, the chief of police can freaking call over there and say, hey, here's the situation. They're still not, I mean, is it within their capacity to make an exception? Because it seems like based on your conversation with them, because they kind of said, well, they didn't provide us with everything we would needed, but we would need to do an override. But it sounds like that means they could technically do an override.
They say they have an override system in place. To date, I have not seen or heard of anyone successfully using that.
Well, if it's not the robbery suspect who's got an ankle monitor on, who's still allegedly punching her mom in the face, I don't really know what would lead to them making an override. So we're very curious and hopefully the conversation goes well for you guys with the presiding judge, and you guys can work something out. Now, is any of this pandemic related still, that they stopped doing it at a certain period of time because of the pandemic and just haven't started back up again?
I don't want to misspeak. I've heard a number of different, staffing. Interesting enough, they say they're built to hold 40. Their average capacity is, 24 to 32. I'm not great at math, but seems that means there's room in the inn there.
Yeah.
They're talking about pandemic. I do think they have a valid concern that they are housing a large number of very violent offenders, homicide suspects, robbery suspects, and they do reasonably need to keep those people separated. So I can't appreciate that. But again, that's what they exist for. That's what they're built for.
Yeah. Gosh, that's all interesting. I mean, I know in King County, for the Department of Adult and Juvenile Detention, I mean, those policies are kind of coming down from Dow Constantine, who, is a politician. And so we'll look into it. I'm very curious who ultimately is the decider on whether they change that policy or not, because I'm just not familiar with it in Pierce County. Well, Chief, we appreciate you speaking out about this, and we'll follow it and see if there's any positive developments.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I can tell you who's not making that decision. Current Pierce County Executive Bruce Dammeier would never stand for that. And I'll tell you that that's another important race, man. If you don't want Pierce County to become King County, you got to vote for Kelly Chambers. You got to vote for Kelly Chambers. Ryan Mello is a Seattle-type progressive, and those are the types of policies that he would push. So we look forward to hearing what comes out of the meeting that he's having about this. Because again, I mean, if you care about nothing else, the liability that must expose the county to if they reject a DV booking and then this kid goes and kills his dad or something. Because, I mean, adults don't get to, there's no choice with adults. You've got to arrest someone, they've got to be booked, etc.